He was Gideon Caruso, the man half of New York wouldn't dare name after 10 o'clock at night. A shadow king who moved billions through boardrooms and blood oaths before the rest of the city had its morning coffee. She was Lena, a waitress pulling $15 an hour at a restaurant where a single bottle of wine cost more than her rent. When his brother screamed at her in front of a packed dining room, "You're nothing," every fork stopped, every breath held, every eye turned. They expected her to cry. They expected her to crumble. They expected the manager to drag her out through the service door like yesterday's trash. But what nobody in that room knew, not the billionaires, not the bodyguards, not even the man who screamed those words, was that Troy Caruso, the prince of New York's most feared crime family, had just spit in the face of the one woman on this earth who held his brother's empire in the palm of her hand, the silent partner behind a deal worth hundreds of millions, the ghost no one had ever seen, the one they only whispered about as the heiress. And she didn't flinch, she didn't cry, she didn't even blink. She just smiled. A small, devastatingly calm smile, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes but carries the weight of a loaded gun, and in a voice so low only the two brothers could hear, she said, "If I'm nothing, then why does your family work for me?" Troy's brain short-circuited. Gideon Caruso, the most dangerous man in the 5 boroughs, a man carved from granite and grief, with steel-gray eyes that had watched men beg, slowly set down his glass, and for the first time in his life, felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up, not because of a threat he could see, but because of the terrifying realization that this woman in a black dress and a white apron had just rearranged the entire power structure of his world with a single sentence. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know her face. But he knew, with the bone-deep instinct that had kept him alive for 36 years, that nothing would ever be the same. If this story gave you chills, smash that like button right now, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because The Waitress hasn't even started yet. But to understand the night when everything collapsed, we have to go back a few hours earlier, to a moment when Aurelia was still a velvet-wrapped dream, and the girl named Lena was still a perfect ghost. Aurelia wasn't just a restaurant. It was a miniature universe suspended on the 2nd floor of a limestone building erected in the 1920s on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, a place where Murano crystal chandeliers poured light onto white linen-covered tables, as if illumination itself were part of the menu. The air here wasn't something people breathed, it was something they wore, heavy with white truffle, old leather, expensive perfume, and an unspoken power that no one named, but everyone felt in the delicate collisions between crystal and Bernardaud porcelain. The dark gray velvet chairs were spaced just far enough apart to turn every conversation into a secret, and the walnut-paneled walls swallowed all sound, except the low laughter of the elite and the soft clink of ice in cocktail glasses. This was where senators dined with people they pretended not to know in daylight, where deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars were nodded into existence over a cut of Wagyu beef, and where the line between legitimate high society and the underworld was as thin as the gold leaf on a dessert plate. And Lena, just Lena, no last name, no past, nothing but a short name on the shift board, had existed flawlessly inside that world for 6 months. Her uniform was what made her invisible. The tailored black dress fitted just enough to be proper, the pristine white apron without a single crease, the flat slip-resistant shoes that made no sound on the marble floor. It was her armor, and also the most perfect disguise she had ever worn, because no one sees the server. No one remembers the face that pours the wine, and that was exactly what she needed. She moved between tables with the quiet grace of a cat, a smile warm enough to put guests at ease but never close enough to be remembered. Dark green eyes lowered just enough while never truly stopping their watch. For 6 months, she had memorized every table, every face, every conversation that powerful guests believed no one else could hear. Tonight she was assigned to Table 7. Inside the restaurant, Table 7 had an unofficial name whispered among the staff in the kitchen. They called it the Shark Tank, because anyone seated at the round table tucked into the darkest corner of the dining room, shielded by a carved wooden screen, was a predator. And tonight, the biggest shark had arrived. Gideon Caruso didn't walk into Aurelia. He took possession of it. There was no noise, no display, just a shift in the atmosphere as if someone had quietly lowered the room temperature by a few degrees. He was 36, yet looked as though time didn't dare touch him, and only stood back to watch, his face all sharp angles as if carved with a blade, a jaw so rigid it seemed he was clenching his teeth, even when there was nothing to be angry about, and steel-gray eyes so cold, people looked away, not out of fear, but out of instinct. His black hair was worn slightly long and slicked back, to reveal a high forehead and a faint scar running along his left temple that he never explained. He wore a flawless black three-piece suit, without a single wrinkle. No jewelry except a tarnished silver signet ring on the little finger of his left hand. His father's ring, the only thing left from the night his father was shot dead on the steps of St. Patrick's Old Cathedral, when Gideon was only 17. Beside him was Troy, his brother, 6 years younger and 10 times louder. A Patek Philippe flashing on his wrist, a tight navy suit, Creed Aventus cologne radiating so strongly that guests at nearby tables leaned away. Troy laughed loudly, spoke loudly, and occupied space as if the world owed him attention. And behind them both, silent like a shadow that never left its owner, stood Rowan Hale, Gideon's underboss, a man of 38, with a face as unreadable as poured concrete, and eyes that never stopped sweeping the room like radar. The 3 men took their seats at table 7, and Lena, just Lena, wine bottle in hand, stepped forward to serve them with the perfect smile of a ghost none of them knew had been watching them for 6 months. Lena set the bottle of Chateau Margaux from 2014 onto the silver tray and walked toward table 7 with the steady cadence she had practiced for 6 months, not fast enough to seem eager, not slow enough to seem arrogant, just enough to become part of the scenery like the floral centerpiece or the burning candle. She had opened this bottle herself in the prep area behind the scenes, checked the label twice, let the wine breathe for exactly 45 minutes in the crystal decanter, reserved only for bottles priced above $2,000. And she knew better than anyone in the room that the dark red liquid resting inside was the right year, the right vineyard, the right drop. She poured a small measure into Troy's glass first, precisely by protocol, tilting the decanter just enough to let the wine slide down the side of the bowl without foaming, then stepped back half a pace to wait for his taste. Troy held the glass with his whole hand instead of by the stem, a small detail that made anyone who truly understood wine wince, lifted it to his mouth, and took a large swallow instead of a sip, then wrinkled his nose as if he had caught an unpleasant smell. "This isn't 2014, Troy declared, not asking, his voice loud enough for the 2 nearby tables to hear, and he shoved the glass back toward Lena as if pushing away something dirty. "This is 2016 at best. Thin, flat, no depth. Bring me a 2009, and don't charge me for this one." Lena kept her face perfectly still, a mask she had honed until it became second nature. Inside, she knew Troy was wrong. She knew it with absolute certainty, because she wasn't just a server. She was someone whose father had taught her to distinguish Bordeaux at 14 in the Sinclair family cellar, among bottles older than her grandfather. But Aurelia's first rule was clear: the guest is never wrong. And the second rule, unwritten but known to every employee from day one, was that the Caruso family was especially never wrong. Because the Caruso family owned 20% of this building, because manager Philip Marsh owed them favors he never wanted named, and because the last time an employee dared contradict a Caruso anywhere in this city, that person vanished from every record as if they had never existed. "I'm sorry, Mr. Caruso," Lena said, her voice properly soft, her eyes lowered just enough to signal submission without surrendering dignity. "I'll bring the 2009 right away." She lifted the decanter, turned, and disappeared toward the bar with steps that made no sound. Troy turned to Rowan and sneered. "See? All you have to do is know who you are, and the world rearranges itself." And Rowan didn't answer, only gave a slight nod, the way he responded to everything Troy said. Enough to avoid disrespect, but not enough to signal agreement. But at the far end of the round table, Gideon Caruso didn't smile. He didn't look at the wine. He didn't look at Troy. He was watching the waitress walk away, and for the first time that evening, his steel-gray eyes narrowed to thin slits, an expression anyone who knew Gideon understood meant he had just noticed something that didn't fit. Not her face. That face was flawless in its role. Not her voice. That voice was measured to the syllable. It was her posture. When Troy shoved the glass back, for a moment shorter than a heartbeat, Lena had changed. Her back straightened. Not the straightness of a trained server, but the straightness of someone accustomed to standing before a boardroom. Her shoulders opened instead of curling inward as instinct would demand from the insulted. And her eyes, those dark green eyes, for 1,000th of a second flashed with something Gideon recognized instantly, because he saw it every day in the mirror. Controlled anger, the anger of someone with real power who chose not to use it yet. Then it vanished. So fast that if Gideon had blinked, he would have missed it. She was Lena again. Just Lena. A $15 an hour server with a gentle smile and silent steps. But Gideon didn't blink. He never did. He lifted his whiskey to his lips, took a measured sip, and filed that girl away in his memory, alongside the things that needed to be watched very, very carefully. The 2009 bottle was brought out, and Troy barely bothered to taste it, giving a curt nod before turning back to his conversation with Rowan about a parcel of land in the South Bronx he called a gold mine, speaking with the tone of a man who regarded the entire city as his personal playground. Lena poured wine for all three men, stepped back half a pace, and began the official stretch of service she knew would be the longest test since the day she first set foot in Aurelia. The appetizer arrived, Hokkaido scallops seared and set on a base of cauliflower cream and truffle oil, and Troy didn't touch it until it had cooled, then snapped his fingers to summon Lena with the dry crack he used the way some people called a dog. Snap. Not excuse me, not miss. Just the sound of thumb and middle finger striking together, cutting through a 3-star Michelin dining room like a whip. And Lena was at the table within 3 seconds, her smile unbroken. "It's cold, sweetheart," Troy said without looking up, stretching the word sweetheart with an inflection every woman recognized instantly as not politeness but possession, "as I can call you whatever I want, because you don't get to object. Take it away and tell the kitchen to be faster next time." Lena nodded, collected the plate, and turned. Snap. Again. "Bring more butter. French butter, not the cheap stuff." Lena brought the butter. Snap. "Top up my wine. My glass should never be below half." Each snap was a small cut, not deep enough to bleed, but steady enough to leave a mark, and Lena endured all of it with the absolute professionalism of someone who had decided 6 months in this role wouldn't be destroyed by Gideon Caruso's arrogant younger brother. The main course arrived, a Wagyu filet cooked medium rare, and Troy cut a piece, chewed, then shoved the plate away with disgust. "Overcooked," he declared. Lena looked at the meat, the center still perfectly pink red, juices seeping onto the white porcelain like irrefutable proof that Troy Caruso was wrong for the second time that night. But she said nothing beyond "I'll inform the kitchen immediately, sir," and carried the plate away, her steps still silent. For the next hour, she moved between table 7 and the kitchen like a shuttle, absorbing each unreasonable demand with calm. And inside the black and white armor, Adeline Sinclair counted each passing minute the way someone counted down to a launch. Then dessert came, and everything shifted. Lena set 3 leather-bound menus on the table, bent just enough to be polite, and as she placed one in front of Troy, he didn't look at the menu. He looked at her. Then his hand came out, not accidentally, not brushing past, but closing around her wrist, fingers locking around the small bones with just enough pressure to hold firm but not enough to be called violence, the pressure of a man who knew exactly which line he could cross without consequence. "You have to smile a lot to earn tips, sweetheart," Troy said, his gaze traveling from her face down and back up again with a slowness so deliberate it stopped being a look and became a touch made with eyes. "What else do you do besides serving?" The question hung in the air with the heavy scent of his cologne, and Lena felt his fingers tighten slightly on her wrist, his thumb tracing a slow circle over her skin, and she had to summon every nerve in her body not to pull away, not to meet his eyes and tell him who she really was. At the head of the table, Gideon saw everything. He saw Troy's hand on the waitress's wrist. He saw the way Troy's eyes moved. He saw the woman stiffen without stepping back, and something in his chest tightened. Not protective anger, because Gideon Caruso didn't feel that for anyone, but something close to a deep-seated irritation he didn't want to name. He didn't like this. He didn't like the way Troy touched a woman without consent. He didn't like that cheap, predatory look, and he especially didn't like the sense that his brother was turning a Caruso table into a stage for vulgarity. But his father's rule, the rule carved into Gideon's bones when he was 12 and seated in his first boardroom, was absolute. Never undermine family in front of outsiders. Never let the world see a crack, because cracks were weakness, and weakness was blood in the water sharks could smell. Gideon lifted his whiskey, took a long drink, and said nothing. Discipline held him silent, but his steel-gray eyes never left the woman's wrist until Troy released it. And in that moment, had Troy been perceptive enough to look at his brother, he would have seen something colder than steel igniting in the eyes of Gideon Caruso. Troy released her wrist and turned to grin at Rowan as if he had just told a good joke. But Lena didn't move. For the first time in 6 months, her slip-resistant shoes stopped on the marble floor and didn't take another step. Something inside her, a bar of steel forged in boardrooms and at her father's funeral, in nights spent alone atop Sinclair Tower, staring down at the city while carrying the weight of an empire no one knew she existed to bear, that thing broke. Not shattered. Broke free. She straightened her back, clasped her hands behind her, and turned to face Troy Caruso directly. Her dark green eyes suddenly so cold, the temperature around table 7 seemed to drop below 0. "Is there a problem with the service, sir?" she asked, and her voice was no longer the soft whisper of Lena the waitress. It was clear, steady, low, the voice of someone accustomed to speaking and being heard. Or is the problem with the guest's behavior? Table 6 heard it. Table 8 heard it. A woman wearing a diamond necklace at table 12 lifted her champagne to her lips and froze mid-motion, crystal touching her mouth without a sip taken, eyes wide and fixed on table 7. A middle-aged couple by the window stopped talking at the same instant, as if someone had pressed mute. A murmur rippled outward from table 7 like waves on still water, table to table, and within 5 seconds all of Aurelia had turned toward the waitress standing like a spear before the Mafia prince of New York. Troy went rigid. His smile died on his lips. No one, not a single person in his 30 years, had ever looked at him that way. Certainly not a $15 an hour girl in a white apron. Blood rushed to his face. His neck flushed red up to his ears, and he shoved his chair back with such force the legs screeched across the stone floor like an animal's snarl. He stood, a head taller than her, a block of navy suit and fury looming in front of her. "Do you know who I am?" Troy roared, his voice no longer contained by restaurant volume but spilling into the bellow of a man used to giving orders and being obeyed. "I can buy this entire building and level it before dawn. I can make you lose your job so fast you won't even have time to untie your apron." He jabbed a finger at her face, his index finger less than a hand's breadth from her nose, and spat each word through clenched teeth. "You're the girl in the apron. You carry food. You clear dirty plates. You're nothing." The word nothing cracked through the opulent room like a gunshot, struck the walnut-paneled walls, echoed off the chandeliered ceiling, and fell to the floor amid the absolute silence of 40 diners, frozen like wax figures, with forks lifted, knives suspended, mouths open without sound. From the host stand, Philip Marsh had started running, not walking fast but truly running, his face pale as paper, hands flailing ahead of him as if trying to stop a derailed train. But Lena didn't look at Philip. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't step back, didn't shake, didn't cry. She simply stood there, held Troy's gaze with her own, and then did the one thing no one in that dining room could have prepared themselves to witness. She smiled, a small smile, calm to the point of cruelty, not reaching her eyes yet, carrying the weight of a final verdict. The smile of someone who knew a secret the man shouting at her couldn't imagine, even if he lived another 100 years. She tilted her head and whispered something only Troy and Gideon were close enough to hear. Then Philip arrived, choking out apologies, and Troy shouted for her to be thrown out. Lena dipped her head politely to Philip, turned, and walked away. But on her way to the service door, she had to pass table 7, past the position of Gideon Caruso, and in that moment she made a mistake, or perhaps it was deliberate. She looked at him. Not a glance. A look. Her dark green eyes met his steel gray ones, and something crossed the space between them that Gideon could describe with only one word. Dangerous. Not the danger of a threat. The danger of recognition. Of looking into someone's eyes, and knowing that beneath every mask, they were made of the same substance as you. Gideon felt the back of his neck go cold. The second time that night, this woman triggered his survival instinct, and this time it screamed something new. Something he had never heard in 36 years, lived among violence and power. It screamed that this woman wasn't running from him. She was walking past him, and she wasn't afraid. Then she vanished through the service door, and Gideon Caruso remained at table 7, his whiskey glass long warmed by his hand because he had forgotten to drink, staring at the closing door, knowing with absolute certainty that tonight wasn't over yet. Philip Marsh's management office sat at the end of the service corridor, a cramped, windowless room crammed with metal filing cabinets, stacks of vendor invoices piled on every flat surface, and the smell of old coffee soaked into the walls from thousands of late nights balancing books. The fluorescent light overhead flickered just enough to cause a headache, but not enough for anyone to bother changing the bulb. And under that sickly glow, Philip Marsh was coming apart. He paced the 3-step stretch between his desk and the filing cabinet, his right hand clutching at thinning hair, losing its battle with middle age, his left hand swiping through the air, as if trying to grab something invisible. Perhaps composure. Perhaps his future. Perhaps both. "Lena, what were you thinking?" he stammered, his voice cracking like fractured glass. "What were you thinking?" That was Troy Caruso. Troy Caruso. Lena, not some tourist who wandered in from Times Square. That was Gideon Caruso's brother. Do you understand what that means? They can shut this place down. They can end me. End me, Lena. Do you understand that word? Lena sat in the only guest chair in the room, a metal folding chair with cracked faux leather padding exposing yellow foam beneath. Her hands folded neatly in her lap, her back straight, her face calm. The mask was still perfectly in place, flawless, uncracked. And if Philip was waiting for tears or begging or any of the things a $15 an hour girl about to lose her job should have done, he would be waiting a very long time. He was inappropriate, Lena said gently. His guest harassed me, Philip. I'm not paid to be humiliated. I'm paid to serve food. Philip stopped pacing and looked at her with eyes full of pity and helplessness. You're paid to do whatever the guest wants, he said, his voice lowering like a man reading a sentence he didn't want to pass. That's the industry, Lena. That's Aurelia. And especially that's the Caruso family. He dropped into his chair, springs groaning under his weight, and the weight of a decision he had no choice but to make. I have to fire you. You know that, right? I don't have a choice. He ordered it. Silence followed. The fluorescent light flickered. Old coffee hung in the air. Then Lena spoke, her voice still calm, but somewhere beneath that calm Philip caught something he couldn't name. Something like ancient exhaustion, the fatigue of someone who had carried too much for too long. Yes, Philip, I understand. You have to fire me. Philip sighed, his shoulders sagging. I'll write you a strong recommendation, he said, and this time the sincerity was real. You're the best employee I have. Always on time. Never complains. Handles every difficult table. Until tonight. 6 months without a single mistake. He looked at her and shook his head. Why, Lena? Why Troy Caruso? Why tonight? Lena met his eyes, and in that moment Philip saw what Gideon Caruso had seen at table 7. The brief flare in those dark green eyes. Not anger, not resentment, but something far larger, something like the deep weariness of someone who had witnessed too much injustice without a voice. And tonight, for the first time, could not stay silent any longer. Everyone has a limit, Philip, she said. Even me. She stood. Her hands moved behind her back, and she untied the white apron with slow, careful motions, as if shedding a layer of skin. She folded the apron into a perfect rectangle, every crease precise, every corner sharp, and placed it on Philip's desk, with the solemnity of a flag folded at a military funeral. Thank you for the opportunity, she said. And the thanks were genuine, because Philip Marsh was the kindest man in this food chain, and they both knew it. Then she turned and walked out without looking back. The service door opened onto the alley behind the restaurant, where Aurelia's luxury vanished as if it had never existed, replaced by the smell of damp trash, the drip of water from old pipes, and the jaundiced light of a bare bulb above the fire exit. Lena drew a deep breath, the first truly free breath in 6 months, and the hot, humid July night air of Manhattan filled her lungs like a reminder that beyond walnut-paneled walls and Murano chandeliers, there was still a real world. The illusion was broken. She pulled the cheap flip phone she used for her Lena life from her dress pocket, looked at it for a second, then slipped it back. She didn't need it anymore. She walked down the sidewalk, slip-resistant shoes tapping softly on concrete. 1 block, then 2, until she saw it. The black Lincoln Continental without plates parked in shadow between 2 old maple trees. Engine off, lights off, nearly invisible to anyone who didn't know to look. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, built like a bank vault, wearing a simple black suit, his face calm and professional, as if picking up a billionaire, disguised as a waitress at 11 at night, in a dark Upper East Side alley, were an everyday task. He walked around the rear of the car, opened the back door, and said in a steady, uninflected voice, "Good evening, Miss Sinclair." Lena vanished. The black and white armor, the service smile, the lowered eyes, all dissolved into the alley's darkness like morning fog in sunlight. The woman sliding into the back seat of the Lincoln was not Lena. She was Adeline Sinclair, and the long night was only just beginning. The Lincoln slipped into the Manhattan night traffic like a black shark gliding through the ocean. Smooth, silent, invisible among thousands of yellow taxis and black Ubers, and inside the cream leather back seat, Adeline Sinclair leaned her head against the seat, closed her eyes, and allowed herself to be weak for exactly 15 seconds. 15 seconds to feel the weight of 6 months pressing down on her shoulders. 15 seconds to remember the sensation of Troy Caruso's fingers tightening around her wrist, and the word nothing spat at her like saliva. 15 seconds to hate herself for nearly losing control, and to hate Troy Caruso for nearly making her lose it. Then the 15 seconds ended. She opened her eyes, and those dark green eyes no longer held exhaustion or anger. Only the one thing that had any use in her world: cold calculation. She opened the center compartment between the back seats and took out the second phone. Not the cheap flip phone of Lena, but a military-grade encrypted smartphone, matte black and unbranded, the kind money couldn't buy on the open market, and could only be obtained through connections her father had built over 40 years. She dialed the only number in its directory, and after 2 rings, Freya Langston's voice came through the line, fully alert despite the hour nearing midnight, because Freya Langston wasn't the kind of woman who slept without permission. Troy walked straight into the trap, Adeline said, her voice clipped and razor-sharp, each word chambered like a loaded round. He lost control in front of 40 witnesses. He harassed me. He showed the entire restaurant who he really is. A brief silence. Then Freya asked in the calm professional tone of a lawyer who had handled crises for the powerful for 20 years. "Were you hurt?" "No. Schedule an emergency meeting with the board. 48 hours. Understood." The call ended. No goodbye. No wasted words. Adeline set the phone aside and looked out the window as Manhattan rewound itself like fast-forwarded film, Midtown's neon glare giving way to quieter streets as the Lincoln turned south toward Tribeca. Barrett didn't ask a single question the entire drive, because Barrett was the kind of man who understood that silence was sometimes the best service one could provide. The car stopped in front of a converted industrial building on Franklin Street, its old red brick facade unmarked, ungated, offering no indication that anyone important lived there. And that was precisely the point. Adeline entered a private elevator, requiring a 6-digit code and fingerprint scan, and 30 seconds later, she stood inside her penthouse on the top floor. The apartment felt less like a home and more like a command center belonging to someone who had turned invisibility into an art form. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls revealed the entire southern Manhattan skyline, from the Freedom Tower blazing like a lighthouse to the Brooklyn Bridge strung with light. Yet inside the apartment, there was almost no illumination beyond the faint glow spilling in from the city. The interior was austerely minimal: black leather sofa, charcoal-polished concrete floors, and on the only wall not made of glass hung a Francis Bacon painting titled "Study after Velázquez's portrait of Pope Innocent X," the image of a screaming face trapped inside a glass cage, a piece her father had purchased at a Christie's auction 20 years earlier, and told her was the most accurate portrait of power he had ever seen, power as a scream imprisoned in silence. Her desk faced the glass wall, heavy black oak set against concrete, and atop it sat 3 computer monitors aligned side by side in sleep mode, along with stacks of classified files in unmarked black leather folders. This was where Adeline Sinclair truly lived, not in a white apron at Aurelia, not in jeans in the South Bronx, but here, among darkness and data and the painting of the silent scream. Her father, Henry Sinclair, had died 2 years earlier in this very penthouse, on that very black leather sofa, terminal lung cancer taking him in 6 months when chemotherapy couldn't buy him another day. Henry Sinclair wasn't Mafia. He was something far more refined, and therefore far more dangerous. The New York underworld called him the architect because he didn't kill, didn't deal drugs, didn't carry a gun. He designed. He built financial and logistical networks so sophisticated that even the Federal Bureau of Investigation acknowledged in internal reports that Henry Sinclair was the only man who could turn dirty money clean without leaving fingerprints. He was a bank, an architect, the financial backbone of multiple families, including the Carusos. And when he died, a massive power vacuum opened that no one realized had been filled by his only daughter, a 25-year-old woman the underworld didn't even know existed. Adeline had spent 2 years building a legend from the shadows, communicating with every one of her father's partners solely through Freya Langston, her personal attorney, right hand, and the only person in the world who knew the face behind the codename. The underworld called her the Heiress, with the reverence reserved for things unseen, because in a world where every face had a price and every name could become a target, the fact that no one knew hers was the most powerful weapon Adeline possessed. She sat at her desk, powered up the 3 monitors, cold blue light washing over her face in the darkness, and opened the first file in the stack of black folders. On the cover, handwritten in black ink, were just 2 words: Project Titan. Project Titan sat in the first file Adeline opened, but it had lived in her mind long before tonight, ever since the day she first saw numbers that didn't align and understood that someone was stealing from the very empire her father had built. On the surface, Titan was a $100 million urban redevelopment project in Helena's Garden, a working-class neighborhood in the South Bronx, spread across 12 acres that New York real estate circles called the last rough diamond because of its Harlem River frontage, proximity to the number 6 subway line, and placement inside a special zoning district the city had just unlocked for redevelopment. The original plan, proposed by Gideon Caruso and approved by the heiress through Freya, involved demolishing the old buildings, constructing a mixed-use luxury residential and commercial complex, and laundering a significant portion of Caruso's underground revenue through the financial architecture Henry Sinclair had designed before his death. Twainty is one. It was a deal between 2 empires, Caruso providing enforcement power and political connections, Sinclair supplying financial structure and legitimate capital, with profits split according to terms Freya had negotiated over 4 months. Gideon Caruso had never met the heiress. Every transaction went through Freya. Every approval carried an encrypted digital signature, and Gideon respected that secrecy, not because he was easygoing, but because Henry Sinclair was the only man his father, the previous Caruso boss, had ever called a friend rather than a partner, and loyalty to the dead sometimes outweighed curiosity about the living. But 3 months earlier, when Adeline sat at this desk at 3 a.m, reconciling the second quarter construction expense report, Troy had submitted against the original bid she had quietly obtained directly from Kiewit Construction. The numbers screamed at her. Kiewit's original contract for all of Phase 1 of Titan was $104 million. The report Troy submitted to the board listed $192 million, a discrepancy of $88 million. Not an error, not overruns, but a black hole that swallowed $88 million without leaving a trace in the official books. Adeline spent 2 weeks tracking that money, following it through 3 international transfers, through a shell company called Apex Pacific Holdings, registered in the Cayman Islands, and ending at a name she recognized instantly: Neil Pruitt, the financial fixer Troy Caruso trusted most. Troy was stealing from Project Titan, meaning he was stealing from both Caruso and Sinclair, stealing from his own brother and stealing from the very woman he had just called nothing tonight at Aurelia. But having paperwork was one thing, proving it before the board and before Gideon was another entirely. Because in the underworld, accusing a family member without proof harder than steel meant the accuser, not the accused, lost their head. She needed direct evidence. Words spoken, meetings, verbal transactions, things that couldn't be denied or explained away as accounting errors. And Aurelia was the only place to get them. Through Freya, she had observed for months that Troy habitually met Neil Pruitt and outside contacts at Aurelia, because the restaurant lay outside Gideon's direct territory, because the noise and discretion of fine dining provided perfect cover, and because Troy was arrogant enough to believe no one would dare listen on his stage. He was wrong. 6 months as a waitress, Adeline heard everything. She heard Troy discuss adjustments with Neil during the wait for the main course. She heard Troy sneer about his big brother who couldn't count when he thought she was too far away to hear. She recorded with a micro-recorder hidden in her apron pocket, a device Freya had sourced from a former National Security Agency operative turned private security consultant in Arlington, Virginia. She photographed documents Troy carelessly left on the table when he thought a server was just a moving object. 6 months, she gathered it all, piece by piece, patient, precise, cold. And tonight, when Troy Caruso called her nothing before 40 witnesses, he didn't know she already had everything needed to bury him. Adeline closed the file, powered down the 3 monitors, and sat in the darkness. Manhattan's light spilled across her face through the glass wall, half illuminated, half shadowed, splitting her in 2 the way her life had been split for 2 years. She looked at the Francis Bacon painting on the wall, the face screaming in silence, and remembered her father's words in his final days as he lay on the black leather sofa, his body so thin the blanket couldn't hold its shape, yet his eyes still burning like headlights through fog. "Power isn't a demolition hammer, daughter," Henry Sinclair had whispered, his voice rough with morphine, yet each word carved in stone. "Power is knowing what to build and who to build it for." Adeline closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind her lids, she saw Helena's garden, saw the people who lived there, and knew that when she finished this, the demolition hammer wouldn't fall on their homes. At the same time, across the city, Gideon Caruso sat in the home office of his 4-story brownstone on the Upper West Side, a room where he never turned on the ceiling light, allowing only the glow of an antique brass desk lamp to spill across the mahogany surface, while the rest of the space sank into shadow, as if darkness were the natural state of every place Gideon occupied. A glass of 25-year Macallan rested in his right hand, liquid amber circling slowly as his fingers traced unconscious loops, and he had been sitting that way for 40 minutes since returning home without taking a single sip, because his mind was elsewhere, still at table 7 in Aurelia, still locked on the dark green eyes of the waitress he couldn't stop thinking about. Not her face, though that face was beautiful in the way a blade at the throat was beautiful, sharp and dangerous and impossible to ignore. It was her smile. That smile didn't belong to a $15 an hour girl. It belonged to someone with power, someone who knew something the man shouting at her could never reach. And Gideon had seen enough powerful people in his life to know the difference between those who pretended confidence and those who truly believed they were in control. She believed it, completely. And the words she whispered before being thrown out, kept spinning in Gideon's head like a bullet that hadn't yet found where to lodge. They made no sense. And because they made no sense, they were dangerous. Because senseless words came either from madness or from someone who knew something he didn't. And that woman wasn't mad. A knock at the door cut through his thoughts. Troy walked in, still wearing the navy suit from the restaurant, the Creed Aventus mostly faded, but the arrogance fully intact. He dropped into the chair across from Gideon's desk with the posture of someone who didn't think he owed an explanation, ankle resting on knee, hands laced behind his head. "Why did you call me?" Troy asked, careless. Gideon didn't look up. He lifted the whiskey and took his first sip of the night, slow, letting the amber slide down his throat, then set the glass down with a soft thud on the wood that sounded like a hammer strike in the silence. "You lost control tonight," Gideon said, his voice neither loud nor emphasized, flat as frozen water. And anyone who knew him understood that the flatter the tone, the deeper the anger. In front of 40 people, in a restaurant where half this city eats, you screamed at a server like a barking dog. Troy straightened, color shifting in his face. "She dared talk back to me, Gideon. A waitress dared look me in the eye and question my behavior. I'm Troy Caruso. No one gets to. Losing control is weakness," Gideon cut in, still not looking at him, steel gray eyes fixed on the glass as if it were far more interesting than his brother. "Weakness is death. Father taught you that when you were 12. Did you forget? Or did you think it didn't apply to you?" Troy clenched his jaw, muscle twitching. "She's just a waitress, Gideon. She's nothing." Gideon finally looked up, and when his steel gray eyes met Troy's, what Troy saw there made him swallow despite himself. "People who are nothing," Gideon said slowly, each word separated like footsteps on thin ice, "are the most dangerous of all, because no one sees them coming." Silence. Troy wanted to argue, but the survival instinct that made him a Caruso kept his mouth shut. He stood, gave a curt nod, and left the room with heavier steps than when he'd entered. Gideon waited until the door fully closed, then picked up his phone and called Rowan Hale. "The waitress named Lena at Aurelia," he said, his voice clipped like a military order. "Find out everything. Real name, address, background, social security number, bank accounts, family, everything. Report to me before noon tomorrow." "Understood," Rowan replied, and hung up. Gideon set the phone down and looked back at the whiskey. In the dark home office, with his father's portrait on the wall behind him, a black and white photograph of a man with the same steel gray eyes and the same silver signet ring on his little finger, Gideon remembered the night his father was shot, 17 years old, standing on the steps of St. Patrick's Old Cathedral on Mulberry Street after Sunday Mass, his hands still scented with candle wax and incense, and his father lay in front of him on the granite steps with 3 bullets in his chest, blood spreading beneath the morning light like a painting no one wanted to make. His father died with his eyes open, And the last thing Gideon saw in those gray eyes before they went dark wasn't fear or pain, but disappointment. Disappointment that he hadn't seen the enemy coming. From that night on, Gideon Caruso swore he would never let anyone get close without seeing them first. And the waitress named Lena, with her cruel smile and that impossible sentence, had come closer than anyone in 20 years without him ever knowing. That didn't frighten him. It woke him up. The next morning, Adeline Sinclair disappeared for the third time. Not Lena in a white apron, not the heiress in a dark penthouse, but a third version. A young woman in faded jeans, a gray crewneck sweater, dark brown hair pulled into a high ponytail, no jewelry, no makeup, wearing an old pair of Nike sneakers scuffed at the edges, looking like any 27-year-old New Yorker heading out for coffee on a Saturday morning. She took the subway, the number 6 line from Tribeca to the South Bronx, standing among weekend riders with one earbud in, and her gaze resting on the train window without truly seeing it, because her mind was already in Helena's Garden, the place she had been visiting for 3 months, under the cover of a community center volunteer, and where she had met Mirabelle Dawson. Helena's Garden didn't live up to its poetic name. It was 12 blocks of apartment buildings constructed in the 1950s, wedged between an abandoned parking lot and elevated subway tracks, where peeling paint revealed layers of lead-gray history, where fire escapes were more rust than reassurance, yet also where potted plants on windowsills were still watered every morning, where children still played basketball in the back lot with a hoop missing its net, and where neighbors still knocked on each other's doors to borrow an onion while cooking. The cafe Adeline went to was a small place called Rosa's on the corner of 149th Street and Willis Avenue, the kind of shop with a handwritten chalkboard menu and $2 coffee that tasted better than anything Aurelia had ever served. Mira Dawson was already seated in the back, a 34-year-old woman with black curls hastily tied with a cloth scarf, brown eyes ringed with the shadows of too many sleepless nights, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup, as if its warmth were the only thing keeping her upright. Adeline sat across from her, ordered black coffee, and Mira began talking without being prompted, because in Helena's Garden everyone was telling the same story, and they told it to anyone willing to listen. Troy Caruso, Mira said. That name was now whispered behind closed doors the way people whispered about disease. His people had arrived 3 months earlier. Men in suits accompanied by lawyers with leather briefcases, knocking on doors with offers to buy apartments for $30,000, places worth at least 4 times that on the open market. Those who refused received notices of building code violations the following week, violations no one had ever heard of before. And those who still refused saw water pipes suddenly burst, infestations suddenly appear, and court-ordered eviction notices suddenly lying on their welcome mats. Pastor Elijah Brooks, a 60-year-old man who had run Grace Baptist Church on Willis Avenue for 30 years and was the only public voice of the community willing to speak out, had been sued for defamation 3 weeks earlier. The suit accused him of embezzling church charity funds, completely fabricated, but sufficient for a district court to freeze the church's assets and suspend all community operations pending resolution, and everyone knew the case would never be resolved because its purpose wasn't to win but to silence. The church was sealed. Pastor Brooks now preached on the sidewalk every Sunday to congregants standing in the rain with no roof overhead. But the worst part was the construction site, Mira said, her voice shaking as the coffee trembled in her hands. Troy had begun demolishing 3 vacant buildings on the edge of the neighborhood before receiving official permits, and the site operated without dust barriers or pollution controls, asbestos and concrete dust filling the air residents breathed every day. Mira's son, Jalen, 4 years old, had suffered from chronic asthma since he was 2, but since construction began, his attacks had tripled, requiring nightly nebulizer treatments and 2 ambulance calls in the past month. The doctor said if the air quality didn't improve, Jalen's lungs would be permanently damaged. Mira said, tears spilling into her coffee, not the tears of weakness, but of a mother who had fought with everything she had and still fallen short. She didn't know what else to do. She couldn't afford a lawyer. She couldn't afford to move. All she had was that apartment, her mother's home, her grandmother's home, 3 generations within those walls, and they wanted to buy it for the price of a used car. Adeline set her coffee down and did something neither Lena nor the heiress was ever supposed to do. She reached across the table and took Mira's hand. Mira's hand was cold and trembling, and Adeline held it with both of hers, warm and steady, meeting the eyes of the woman breaking in front of her. No one has to leave their home, Adeline said, and her voice wasn't the voice of a volunteer. It was the voice of someone accustomed to issuing commands and being heard, Yet this time it carried something commands lacked: sincerity. Mira looked at her, tears still wet on her cheeks, and in those tired brown eyes a thin spark of hope flickered for the first time in months, alongside doubt born of too many betrayals. "Who are you?" Mira whispered. "You're just a volunteer." "You can't promise that. No one can promise that against the Caruso family." Adeline didn't release her hand. She looked at this 34-year-old single mother, clutching a $2 coffee in a small South Bronx cafe with a 4-year-old who couldn't breathe, and she saw exactly what her father had meant about power, about demolition hammers, about who you build for. "I'm the one who keeps promises," Adeline said, and Mira looked into those dark green eyes and saw something she couldn't explain. Not the kindness of a volunteer, but power. Not the frightening power Troy Caruso wielded, but power like a wall, power that protected. 24 hours after the dinner at Aurelia, Freya Langston called the only contact line between Sinclair and Caruso, Conrad Byrne, Gideon's consigliere, and informed him that the heiress was requesting a direct meeting to discuss Project Titan. Conrad fell silent for 3 seconds, an unusually long pause for a 55-year-old man who had handled every kind of request from every kind of person over 3 decades in service to the Caruso family, because in the 2 years since Henry Sinclair died, the heiress had never once asked for a face-to-face meeting, and her sudden decision to break that rule meant that either something very important was happening or something very bad was about to. Gideon received the message from Conrad in his home office, the same whiskey, the same darkness, and he agreed immediately, not because he trusted the request, but because he was curious. And Gideon Caruso's curiosity was the most dangerous weapon in his arsenal, because it never stopped until he had his answer. The VIP room at the Carlisle Hotel sat on the top floor of the iconic Art Deco building on Madison Avenue on the Upper East Side, a room John Fitzgerald Kennedy once used for private meetings, and that later presidents continued to reserve under assumed names, when in New York, with 4-meter ceilings, vintage chandeliers from the 1930s, windows overlooking Central Park, and most importantly, an absolute discretion. Money couldn't buy, and only reputation could. Gideon arrived 15 minutes early with Rowan and Conrad, as was his habit, because the one who arrived first controlled the space, and the one who controlled the space controlled the game. Rowan swept the room for listening devices while Conrad arranged the chairs so Gideon faced the door. His back never turned to any angle he couldn't control, and Gideon sat, buttoned his jacket, placed both hands on the table, and waited. Then the door opened. The woman who entered the room was nothing like anything Gideon had prepared himself for. He didn't know what he had expected. Perhaps a hard-edged, middle-aged woman like Freya. Perhaps an older matriarch with quiet authority. But certainly not this. She was young, much younger than he had imagined. 27 perhaps, and beautiful in the way darkness was beautiful. Not bright, but deep. The kind of beauty that made you look twice, not because you wanted to, but because you had to. A black dress to the knee, perfectly tailored to follow her body without revealing anything. Fabric and stitching only the trained eye understood. A quiet luxury money alone never learned. Dark brown hair fell naturally over her shoulders, not styled, not forced, as if she didn't need to try. No jewelry except one thing. A silver ring on the ring finger of her right hand engraved with a simple S, and Gideon recognized it instantly as a family ring, because he wore a similar one on the little finger of his left hand. She carried a kind of power Gideon rarely encountered. Quiet power. The kind that didn't need a bigger room or a louder voice. The kind that simply entered, and the room rearranged itself around it. Gideon rose, out of courtesy, and when he looked at her, something struck his chest. Not recognition, not yet, but a vague familiarity, like hearing a melody he knew he had heard before, but couldn't place. The eyes, those dark green eyes, and the way she stood, back straight, shoulders open, chin lifted just enough. He narrowed his gaze for a fraction of a second and let it go, unnoticed by everyone in the room except Adeline, who had spent 6 months learning to read every micro-movement on Gideon Caruso's face. "Miss Sinclair," Gideon said, his voice low and polite, revealing nothing. "Mr. Caruso," Adeline replied, taking the seat opposite him without waiting to be invited. And that small act said more than any introduction. It said she wasn't a guest but an equal partner. She spoke in a cool, professional tone, each sentence precise like a surgical cut. Project Titan had a problem. The finances didn't align. There was a traitor inside siphoning money from the project, and she had reason to believe that person was very close to Gideon. She didn't name Troy, not yet, but she let the silence after very close do the rest of the work. "I want you to handle this," Adeline said. And though her tone was courteous, the structure of the sentence wasn't a request but an ultimatum. "Before I'm forced to handle it myself. And you won't like how I do it." Gideon leaned back, studying her with the steel-gray eyes he used to read people the way he read contracts, line by line, hidden clause by hidden clause. "Why hide your face for 2 years?" he asked. "Because my father taught me that the most familiar face is the most dangerous one," Adeline replied without blinking. Gideon was silent for 2 seconds. Then a small smile appeared on his mouth. The first genuine smile Rowan and Conrad had seen on their boss's face in a long time. Dangerous but impressed, as if he had finally found a worthy opponent after years of playing chess alone. "Your father was a wise man," he said. "You are too." Adeline stood to end the meeting, and as she placed her fingertips on the oak table to push her chair back, the sleeve of her black dress shifted slightly, and Gideon saw it. A small crescent-shaped scar on her left wrist, silvery white against her skin, old but unmistakable. The kind of scar he knew wasn't an accident because the shape was too precise, too deliberate. He didn't ask, but he filed it away in the same mental compartment where he kept the smile at Aurelia and the impossible sentence, and that compartment was now close to full. Adeline felt his gaze. She didn't look down at her wrist, didn't pull her sleeve back, didn't acknowledge anything. But on her skin, exactly where Gideon Caruso's eyes had just touched, she felt heat, as if he had actually touched her with his hand instead of his gaze, and she had to use every ounce of discipline 6 months of being Lena had forged to keep from turning around as she walked out, because if she did, he would see what she didn't want anyone to see, that her heart was beating faster than normal, and that wasn't part of the plan. While Adeline Sinclair and Gideon Caruso were measuring each other at the Carlisle, on the other side of the city in a short-term rental penthouse on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, Troy Caruso was receiving a call he didn't want to take. Neil Pruitt called at 11 at night, and the voice of the 33-year-old accountant Troy, trusted above anyone else, with money trembled like a string pulled too tight. "Someone's tracing the Cayman accounts," Neil said, and Troy could hear frantic keyboard tapping in the background as if Neil were trying to erase something while talking. "Apex Pacific Holdings. Someone requested the last 3 months of transaction history from the bank. The request came through a Manhattan law firm. I haven't identified which one yet, but they have high-level access, the kind only very big players have." Troy stood in the living room, staring out at the Brooklyn skyline, and the blood in his veins went cold for 2 seconds before his defensive instinct kicked in. Not the instinct of a clever man, but of an aggressive one, the kind that solved problems by hitting harder instead of thinking deeper. "Burn it all," Troy said, his voice sharp. "Move the remaining balance to the backup account in Belize. Shut down Apex Pacific. Burn every trail, Neil. Every trail. Burning trails takes time. At least I didn't ask how long. I told you to do it." Troy hung up and began pacing like a caged animal, thoughts spinning. Someone was digging. Someone powerful enough to touch offshore accounts he believed untouchable. He thought of Gideon first, then dismissed it. Because if Gideon knew, Troy wouldn't be standing here thinking. He'd be at the bottom of the East River, with concrete on his feet. Then, he thought of the heiress. The timing too perfect. The sudden meeting Conrad had just reported. The first time in 2 years that Ghost had agreed to show her face. And Troy didn't believe in coincidences because his father taught him there were none in this world. Only plots you hadn't seen yet. He needed insurance. He needed an exit Gideon didn't control. He took out his second phone, the one Gideon didn't know existed, and dialed a Brooklyn number that would have gotten Troy killed long ago if anyone in the Caruso family knew he had it saved. The Moreno family, the Caruso's ancestral rivals in Brooklyn. The family Gideon's father had warred with for 20 years. The family Gideon had kept in a fragile balance through diplomacy and intimidation, since taking power. Troy had been in contact with them for 2 months, selling small pieces of internal information about Gideon's routes and schedules in exchange for a promise of protection if things collapsed. And tonight he upgraded the deal. He offered the complete Caruso financial blueprint, laundering networks, hidden asset lists, names of bought officials, everything he knew as the boss's brother, in exchange for full protection and a slice of new territory in Queens. Betrayal not just of money but of blood. Not just theft, but selling his own brother to the enemy. But Troy Caruso didn't stop there. Because panic didn't just make rats run, it made rats bite. and Troy bit in the direction he believed carried the least risk: people who couldn't defend themselves. He called his enforcement team in the South Bronx and ordered pressure increased on Helena's garden immediately, tonight. Not arson. Troy wasn't stupid enough to leave something that obvious, but calculated sabotage, the kind that looked like natural damage from aging structures, the kind no agency bothered to investigate. At 2 a.m, 3 men, no one in Helena's garden saw, entered the basement of the community center on Willis Avenue, smashed the main water line with sledgehammers flooding the ground floor, sawed through 2 roof supports, creating a structural crack that caused a partial ceiling collapse, and in the process, concrete dust, plaster dust, and dust from old asbestos insulation rose into a white cloud that spilled into the humid summer night air of the South Bronx and drifted through open windows of surrounding apartments. Mira Dawson woke to the sound of Jalen coughing. Not a normal cough, but the choking kind. The cough any mother of an asthmatic child recognized even in the deepest sleep, and rose before her mind fully caught up. He lay on the bed, chest whistling with each breath, lips starting to pale, eyes wide with a fear a 4-year-old didn't have words for. Mira ran to the medicine cabinet, fitted the albuterol inhaler, but this time it wasn't enough. Jalen's chest kept tightening, the wheeze grew sharper, and Mira dialed 911, with hands shaking so badly she had to try 3 times. The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes. 7 minutes in which Mira held her son on the bedroom floor, singing the lullaby her mother had sung to her in this same apartment, her voice shaking but unbroken, because if she stopped singing she would scream. When the paramedics placed the oxygen mask over Jalen's face and he began to breathe, Mira stepped into the hallway, leaned against the wall, slid down to the floor, and cried. Then, she took out her phone and called the only number she believed would answer, the number of the volunteer named Adeline she had met the morning before at Rosa's. At 2:17 in the morning, the encrypted phone of Adeline Sinclair vibrated on the bedside table in the Tribeca penthouse, and she answered on the first ring. Mira's voice on the other end wasn't speech so much as sobs shaped like words. Jalen. Hospital. The community center collapsed. Dust everywhere. I don't know what to do. Adeline sat up in bed, and in the darkness of the penthouse, her dark green eyes lit with a kind of light that, if Troy Caruso had seen it, he would have understood he had just signed his own death warrant. Adeline arrived at Lincoln Hospital on 149th Street in the South Bronx at 3 a.m, still wearing the gray sweater and jeans, hair hastily tied back. No makeup, no Barrett, no black Lincoln. Taking a regular taxi because this wasn't the moment for the heiress to appear, but the moment for Adeline, only Adeline, to be beside the only friend she had in her real life, rather than in any role she played. The pediatric emergency ward at Lincoln Hospital at 3 a.m. was its own kind of hell. Cold, white fluorescent lights, washing over pale green walls yellowed with age, the smell of antiseptic mixed with vinyl flooring, the steady beeping of heart monitors leaking from behind green curtains like a countdown. No one knew how far it went. Mira sat on a plastic chair beside the hospital bed, shoulders hunched, both hands wrapped around Jalen's tiny hand, and when Adeline pushed past the curtain, the first thing she saw wasn't Mira, but the 4-year-old child on the white bed, round cheeks turned ashen under the lights, eyes closed, mouth covered by a clear oxygen mask fogged with each shallow breath, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm still labored, though the medication had begun to work. An intravenous line taped to his small arm with bear-shaped tape meant for children, but unable to soften the cruelty of a 4-year-old lying on oxygen at 3 a.m, because a 30-year-old man decided profit mattered more than a child's lungs. Adeline stood there, and something inside her broke. Not the cold steel of the heiress, not the calm mask of Lena, but something deeper and softer she had buried since the day her father lay on the black leather sofa in the Tribeca penthouse and drew his final breaths through an identical oxygen mask. The same beeping, the same smell, the same helplessness of sitting beside someone you loved and being able to do nothing but hold their hand. She pulled a second plastic chair close, sat beside Mira, and said nothing, simply reaching out to take Mira's other hand, cold and shaking, and holding it tight. Mira turned toward her, eyes swollen and red, cheeks still wet, and under the hospital lights, the 2 women sitting side by side weren't a billionaire and a single mother. They weren't the heiress and a resident of Helena's garden, just 2 human beings in pain, one aching because her son lay there, the other aching because she remembered the last time she had sat beside a hospital bed like this, and the person on it had never stood again. "You came," Mira whispered, her voice hoarse from crying, and the words were so simple they cut deep, because they meant Mira had called, without knowing whether anyone would come, and Adeline had come, and sometimes that was enough. Adeline watched Jalen breathe, the small chest rising and falling, the monitor beeping steadily, oxygen saturation climbing to 94, then 95. He was stabilizing. He would be all right tonight. But tonight wasn't the problem. Tomorrow night and the nights after were. Every night, until Troy Caruso's construction site stopped pouring dust into this child's lungs. "I'm going to end this," Adeline said, her voice low and meant only for Mira. And her eyes as she looked at Jalen were cold as steel, cold as Gideon Caruso's gray eyes, cold in the way only someone who had decided could be. No weighing, no hesitation, only judgment. Yet the hand holding Mira's still trembled, just slightly, enough for Mira to feel but not see, and that tremor was the truest thing Adeline Sinclair had shown in 2 years, because it meant that beneath every layer of armor, beneath code names and penthouses and encrypted phones and perfect plans, she was still human, still capable of pain, still capable of fear, still capable of anger in the way only someone with a heart could be angry. Angry for something larger than herself. She stayed beside Mira until Jalen slept more peacefully, breathing even oxygen at 97, the night nurse saying he could be discharged in the morning. Then Adeline gently released Mira's hand, stood, and stepped into the hospital corridor. At 4 a.m, the hallway was empty, only fluorescent light, antiseptic smell, and the distant footsteps of a night nurse. Adeline leaned back against the wall, closed her eyes for 3 seconds, then opened them. And when she did, the tremor was gone. Her hands steady as stone, and the heiress had returned. She took out the encrypted phone and called Freya Langston. "Move it up," Adeline said, her voice sharp as a freshly honed blade. "Don't wait 48 hours. Tomorrow morning." Rowan Hale called Gideon at 7 a.m, earlier than the noon deadline Gideon had set, and that meant the news was either bad or deeply strange, because Rowan never called early unless what he found was important enough to break the boss's rest. Gideon hadn't slept. He was still sitting in his home office with the third glass of Macallan already empty and his father's portrait looking down from the wall, and he answered after half a ring. "She doesn't exist," Rowan said, his voice flat as concrete but with a trace of confusion underneath that Gideon rarely heard from him. "Lena, no last name. The social security number she used to apply at Aurelia belongs to a 63-year-old woman who died in Tucson, Arizona 7 years ago. The address she listed is a studio apartment in Hell's Kitchen. I had someone check it. The apartment exists, but no one lives there. Minimal furniture, no photos, no mail, no personal traces. It looks more like a safe house than a home. The bank account was opened 3 days before she started working at Aurelia. Only salary deposits in and rent payments out. No other transactions. No hospital records, no school records, no driver's license, no passport. She's a ghost, Gideon. A perfect fake identity. Professional grade. The kind only someone with enormous resources and deep experience could create. Gideon was silent for a long time after Rowan finished. Long enough that Rowan checked whether the call was still connected. But Gideon hadn't disconnected. He was assembling. In his mind, the fragments he'd collected over the past 2 days began to rotate, collide, test every configuration, then fall into place with a click only he could hear. The dark green eyes of the waitress at table 7 were the same dark green eyes of the woman sitting across from him at the Carlisle. The straight back and open shoulders Lena held when she was humiliated were the same posture Adeline Sinclair held when she delivered her ultimatum. The small crescent-shaped scar on the wrist he'd glimpsed when she placed her hand on the table at the Carlisle was in the same place Troy had grabbed her wrist at Aurelia. But that night the candlelight had been too dim for him to see clearly. And the sentence Lena whispered before she was fired, "Why are you working for me?" was no longer absurd now. It was naked truth, spoken by the woman who held half of Project Titan and had the authority to dismiss anyone in the chain of command, including Troy. Gideon set the phone down and stared into the dark. Lena was Adeline Sinclair. The heiress had been right in front of him for 6 months, pouring his wine, serving his food, enduring his brother's humiliation, and he hadn't seen her. That filled him with both admiration and a chill. But he wasn't 100% certain, and Gideon Caruso didn't act on 99%. He needed to look into her eyes one more time. He requested a second meeting with the heiress through Conrad, and this time he came alone. No Rowan, no Conrad, just him. Adeline came alone as well. The location was a basement jazz bar on Bleecker Street in Greenwich Village, the kind of place with stairs so narrow 2 people couldn't walk side by side. Lighting so dim faces became outlines and shadow, and a saxophone echoing off bare brick, like someone telling a very long, very sad secret. They sat across from each other at a corner table, 2 glasses of whiskey, and Gideon didn't ask about Titan, didn't ask about the traitor, didn't ask about the Cayman accounts. He asked about her father. Adeline was silent for 3 seconds, studying him with dark green eyes in the low light, weighing whether this was strategy or sincerity. Then she decided, perhaps because the bar was too dark for masks, perhaps because she'd just sat beside a 4-year-old's hospital bed and exhaustion had worn her armor thin, perhaps because his steel-gray eyes in that moment weren't cold but quiet in a way only someone who understood loss could be quiet, she told him. Carefully but honestly, Henry Sinclair was the only person who ever made her feel safe in the world. And when he died, that safety died with him. And what remained was an empire and responsibility, and a loneliness so deep she sometimes forgot where the bottom was. Gideon listened. Then he told his own story, not because she'd gone first and courtesy demanded it, but because for the first time in many years, he wanted to. His father was shot on the steps of a church, 17 years old, blood on granite, eyes open, looking at him, then gone. He built everything from that ash heap, 1 brick at a time, and beneath every brick was rage, and beneath the rage was pain he'd never spoken to anyone about. The silence afterward stretched like the saxophone fading at the end of a song, not uncomfortable, not heavy, just 2 of the most powerful people in the city, sitting in a dark basement, and looking at each other and recognizing what they'd never found anywhere else, the same loneliness. Not loneliness from lack of people, but loneliness from having too many people around, and no one seeing who they truly were. Gideon reached across the table and lightly touched the back of her hand, not gripping, not pulling, just resting his fingertips on her skin so lightly she could have pretended not to feel it if she wanted to. She didn't pull away. She let his fingers stay there, warm against her cold skin, and they both knew this was dangerous ground. Not dangerous like guns, but something far worse. The kind where 2 people who shouldn't trust each other begin to trust, where 2 people who shouldn't need each other begin to need, and in their world, where every weakness was a target, this could destroy them both. At 6 a.m, in the Tribeca penthouse, Adeline still hadn't slept. She sat at the black oak desk facing 3 monitors, glowing blue, her hair still hastily tied from the hospital, her 3rd cup of black coffee gone cold beside her, and across from her sat Freya Langston, the 40-year-old woman with shoulder-length blonde hair, wearing a perfectly pressed gray suit despite having been awake all night, because Freya wasn't the kind of person who allowed wrinkles to appear on her clothes or on her plans. Between them, the desk was spread with files, and Adeline arranged them in presentation order with the precision of someone laying out weapons before a battle. The first file was the construction contract, 2 versions side by side, the original from Kiewit Construction, listing $104 million, and the version Troy submitted to the board, listing $192 million, the figures circled in red, the $88 million gap between them as stark as blood on white snow. The second file was the transfer records from a Cayman Islands bank, 3 transfers over 6 weeks into an Apex Pacific Holdings account under Neil Pruitt's name, every date and amount clearly documented, irrefutable proof that the money had left the project and gone into Troy's pocket. The third file, and the one Adeline considered the killing shot, was the audio, 6 recordings captured by a micro-device hidden in Lena's apron over 6 months at Aurelia, 3 of them clearly recording Troy discussing adjustments with Neil, and 1 recording Troy on the phone with a contact Freya had verified as a Moreno family intermediary, during which Troy referenced Caruso shipping routes at the Red Hook port. Financial betrayal could be forgiven. Betraying blood to an enemy never was, especially not by Gideon Caruso. The fourth file contained photos of the community center on Willis Avenue after the sabotage, burst water pipes, a collapsed roof, white dust coating every surface, taken by someone Freya had sent to the scene at 4 a.m. while Adeline was still at the hospital. And the final file was Jalen Dawson's medical record from Lincoln Hospital, a 4-year-old with chronic asthma worsened by exposure to asbestos and concrete dust from an unpermitted construction site, 2 emergency admissions in 1 month, with a prognosis warning of permanent lung damage if the pollution source wasn't eliminated. Adeline set the last file down and looked at Freya. "Is it enough?" she asked, and it wasn't really a question. Freya nodded. "Enough to bury him 10 times. At 7 in the morning, Adeline called Mira. Mira answered immediately from the hospital, her voice hoarse from being awake all night. "How's Jalen?" Adeline asked first. "He's stable. The doctor says he can be discharged around noon." "Good. Listen to me, Mira. There's an important meeting today in Midtown Manhattan. I want you there. Bring your plan. The proposal you showed me at Rosa's. The one about redeveloping Helena's garden." Silence. "Adeline, that's just a few handwritten pages I drafted at my kitchen table at midnight. No one will listen. I will. And today, the most powerful people in the room will listen too. Bring it, Mira." Mira was quiet for 3 seconds, then said, her voice shaking but not with fear, "I'll be there." Adeline ended the call and turned to Freya. "Send a formal summons to Gideon Caruso through Conrad. Emergency Sinclair board meeting, 10 a.m. today at Sinclair Tower. Subject: reassessment of Project Titan. Require Gideon to bring Troy, since Troy is the direct project lead and must report on progress." Freya made a note, then looked up. "Gideon will know this is a trap." "Gideon's known for a while," Adeline said, and there was something softer than steel in her voice, just for a moment. "But he'll come, because he needs the truth more than he needs to protect Troy." Freya didn't comment, but she noticed it was the first time Adeline had referred to Gideon Caruso as he, instead of Mr. Caruso, or simply Caruso. On the Upper West Side, Conrad Byrne delivered the summons to Gideon in his home office. Gideon read the message, set his phone down, and sat very still in the dark, the silver signet ring turning slowly on his pinky. Then he called Rowan. 10 a.m., Sinclair Tower. Bring Troy. And Rowan, he paused, prepare for every possibility. Sinclair Tower stood at the corner of 52nd Street and Park Avenue like a black blade driven into the Manhattan sky. 63 floors of dark glass reflecting clouds and light, while revealing nothing of what lay inside. And the boardroom on the 60th floor was a space Henry Sinclair had designed not to impress, but to make anyone who entered understand immediately that they were standing on someone else's ground. The table was a 6-meter slab of black obsidian, cut and polished until its surface reflected the faces of those seated like still water, surrounded by 14 high-backed black leather chairs. Henry used to joke looked more like judges' thrones than conference seating. 3 glass walls opened onto all of Manhattan from Central Park in the north to the tip of the island in the south. But that morning the sky was dull gray, and the light spilling into the room was cold, without warmth, a steel-colored glow that matched Gideon Caruso's eyes. The Sinclair board was already seated. 4 senior members Adeline had personally selected over the past 2 years, each loyal to the Sinclair family, and each briefed by Freya since 6 that morning on what would happen in this room. Freya sat to the right of the empty head chair, hands resting on a stack of black leather folders, calm as someone who had been preparing for this moment for 2 years. Conrad Byrne occupied the guest seat, his 55-year-old face expressionless while his eyes kept moving between the door and the empty chair. Mira Dawson sat in a separate seat near the end of the table, out of place among obsidian stone and reinforced glass like a wildflower growing through concrete, wearing the cleanest white blouse she owned from the day before, clutching an old manila folder containing handwritten plans drafted at her kitchen table at midnight, her eyes scanning the room with the confusion of someone who didn't understand why she was there but trusted the person who had brought her. At exactly 10, the heavy double oak doors opened, and Gideon Caruso entered with Troy and Rowan. Gideon wore a black 3-piece suit, the silver signet ring on his pinky, his face unreadable as gray eyes swept the room in a second and a half, logging chair positions, head count, exits, and the still empty seat at the head of the table. Troy followed in a navy suit, and Patek Philippe watch, the confident smile of a man who didn't know he was walking into a courtroom, glancing around with a false sense of ownership, nodding at Conrad, flicking his eyes toward Mira for a second, before dismissing her as unimportant. They sat. Troy leaned toward Gideon and murmured something about this meeting being a waste of time, and Gideon didn't respond. Silence fell, 15 seconds of it, the kind where you could hear your own blood moving. Then the doors opened again. Adeline Sinclair stepped inside, and the room changed. She looked nothing like any version anyone there had seen before. Not Lena in a white apron, not the girl in jeans in the South Bronx, not the woman in black at the Carlisle. This was the final version, the real one. A perfectly tailored black suit over a collarless white shirt, straight-cut black trousers, black heels striking marble with a steady rhythm like a countdown. Dark brown hair swept into a high bun, exposing her entire face. Sharp cheekbones, a small but unyielding chin, and deep green eyes fixed straight ahead without blinking. No jewelry except the silver ring engraved with an S on her ring finger. Her face was completely without expression, empty in a way that was terrifying, like the surface of a lake before a storm. She walked to the head of the table, stopped behind the chair, and did not sit. Troy looked up, and his confident smile died. The blood drained from his face so fast his skin went from pink to ashen in seconds, as if a valve had been opened beneath him. He sprang to his feet, chair scraping back, and when he spoke, his voice carried something no one in that room had ever heard from Troy Caruso: panic. You're the waitress from Aurelia." Adeline didn't look at Troy. She hadn't granted him that privilege yet. Gideon didn't stand. He didn't move. He sat still with both hands on the obsidian table and looked at her, and in his steel-gray eyes the final pieces locked into place with a click that this time wasn't his alone, but echoed through the collapse of his old world. Lena, the heiress, the green eyes, the scar, the words, all one person. And on Gideon, Caruso's lips appeared not anger or betrayal, but a small, fleeting smile that held two things that shouldn't coexist yet somehow did: profound admiration and absolute horror. Adeline finally lowered her gaze to the table, to everyone present. And when she spoke, her voice was clear, neither loud nor soft, cutting through the silence like a surgical incision through skin. "My name is Adeline Sinclair, the only daughter of Henry Sinclair, chairwoman of the Sinclair Industries Board, and yes, Troy." For the first time she looked at him, green eyes meeting his panic-stricken stare. "6 months ago I poured your wine at table 7. Adeline didn't take the chair at the head of the table. She remained standing, because what she was about to do didn't require the comfort of leather, but the precision of someone standing before a tribunal. She gave Freya a slight nod, and Freya activated the large screen mounted on the east wall. Cold blue light washing over every face in the room like the glow of a morgue. The first slide appeared, 2 contracts placed side by side, and Adeline began to speak in a voice that was neither fast nor slow, neither loud nor soft, the voice of a forensic pathologist reading an autopsy report. "This is the Phase 1 construction contract for Project Titan, obtained directly from the contractor Kiewit Construction by my office. Total value $104 million. She clicked. The second contract filled the screen. "And this is the version Troy Caruso submitted to our board. Total value $192 million. Click. The 2 numbers sat side by side in red, and the space between them looked like an open wound. The discrepancy is $88 million. The temperature in the boardroom seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Troy sat rigid in his chair, hands gripping the armrests until his knuckles turned white, and Adeline gave him no time to breathe. Click. A transfer diagram appeared. 3 red arrows pointing from the project account to an Apex Pacific Holdings account in the Cayman Islands. 3 transfers in 6 weeks, each amount and date as clear as fingerprints on a murder weapon. $88 million was transferred into a shell company, Apex Pacific Holdings, registered in the Cayman Islands, under the name Neil Pruitt. Adeline looked at Troy for exactly 1 second. "Your financial fixer, Troy." Troy opened his mouth, but no words came out, like a fish dragged from water, gasping without sound. Adeline didn't wait. Click. Audio filled the room through the ceiling speakers. Troy Caruso's voice, unmistakable down to every vowel. His own voice recorded at Table 7 at Aurelia, reading Caruso shipping routes at the Red Hook port to a Moreno family contact he thought no one could hear, laughing and sneering that his older brother couldn't count, the contempt now echoing in front of that very brother. Gideon didn't move. Not a muscle in his face shifted. But Rowan, the concrete man seated behind him, closed his eyes for 1 second, and when he opened them, there was something like disgust in them. Adeline stopped the recording and clicked again. Images appeared. The Willis Avenue Community Center. Roof collapsed. Ground floor flooded. White dust coating every surface. Photographed at 4 a.m. just hours earlier. Click. Lincoln Hospital records. Patient Jalen Dawson, 4 years old. Acute asthma triggered by asbestos exposure. Emergency admission. Prognosis warning of permanent lung damage. Mira at the end of the table began to cry silently, hand over her mouth, staring at her son's medical record on the massive screen of the 60th floor boardroom, and realizing that the volunteer she had met at Rosa's, the woman who held her hand in the hospital at 3 a.m, was the same woman standing at the head of the obsidian table, tearing an empire apart for her and for Jalen. Adeline shut off the screen. The room fell into a silence as heavy as molten lead. And Troy Caruso, like any animal cornered, didn't choose surrender. He chose to bite. He shoved his chair back so hard it flipped and crashed onto the marble floor with a bang that echoed through the room. And he stood, face purple, veins bulging, finger stabbing toward Adeline as he screamed. "You inherited everything," Troy hissed through clenched teeth, spit flying with every word. "You didn't build a damn thing. You never earned $1 with your own hands. You're just a girl who dressed up as a waitress and snuck into kitchens to spy. You're a joke. You're your father's puppet." He stalked around the table, no lawyer present to restrain him, Rowan unmoving because Gideon hadn't signaled, and Troy loomed over Adeline, a full head taller, shaking with rage that had nowhere left to go but out through his mouth. "You stood there and let my brother humiliate you," he stuttered, realizing he'd just referred to himself in the third person as if talking about someone else, then roared on. "You know why? Because that's all you are. A uniform, a server. You're nothing. Nothing." The word fell into the 60th floor boardroom the way it had at Aurelia, but this time it landed before 14 witnesses, before the board, before his own brother, and before the woman whose name was carved into the building he stood in. Adeline didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't narrow her eyes. She let the silence stretch, let Troy's venom hang in the air, naked, powerless, pathetic. She looked at the 30-year-old man shaking and screaming in front of her and saw exactly what he was. Not a Mafia prince, not a man of power, just a spoiled child enraged at being caught. Then she smiled. That smile, small, calm, lethally precise, never touching her eyes yet carrying the weight of a life sentence. The smile of someone who'd been sharpening the blade for 6 months and knew exactly where to cut. She tilted her head, the same way she had at table 7 at Aurelia, and in a clear, cold voice that sliced through Troy's shouting like a knife through butter, she said, "If I'm nothing, Troy, then why does your family work for me?" Troy froze, mouth open, no sound. Every ounce of fury, every scrap of bravado, every piece of identity he'd built drained out of him in a single second like a plug pulled from a wall, and what stood before Adeline Sinclair wasn't Troy Caruso, the Mafia prince, but an empty, trembling man, and for the first time in his life, completely silent. The silence after Adeline's words stretched 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, and in those 15 seconds, no one in the 60th floor boardroom dared to breathe because every eye was fixed on one man, Gideon Caruso, waiting for his reaction the way people wait for a judge's verdict when the sentence could mean life or death. Gideon had remained seated through Adeline's entire presentation, through Troy's screaming, through the kill shot, unmoving, expressionless, both hands resting on the obsidian tabletop like slabs of stone, the silver signet ring on his pinky catching the cold light from the windows. Then he stood, slowly. The chair didn't make a sound because he eased it back with his calf. The perfect control of a man who never made noise he didn't intend to make. He straightened to his full height, taller than anyone else in the room, and the silence around him grew so dense it felt cuttable. The entire room held its breath. Freya clenched her pen beneath the table. Conrad closed his eyes for 1 second as if praying. The 4 Sinclair board members glanced at one another, then at Gideon, then back again. Rowan stood behind him, his right hand shifting slightly toward his hip in a reflex carved into muscle by 20 years at Gideon's side. And at the far end of the table, Mira clutched the manila folder to her chest, tears still wet on her cheeks, staring at the most powerful man in New York's underworld standing up and wondering if she had just witnessed the last moments of her life. No one knew which side Gideon would choose, blood or justice, brother or truth, 30 years of protecting Troy or 15 minutes of evidence. It was a calculation no rulebook of the underworld had ever taught him how to solve, because his father had taught him that family was everything, but his father had also taught him that blood traitors paid in blood, and when the traitor was blood, the rule collapsed and detonated. Gideon looked at Troy, his brother, the baby he had held when Troy cried on the first night after their father was shot, the 11-year-old boy whom 17-year-old Gideon had sworn over their father's coffin to protect with his life, now standing before him at 30, face ashen, lips trembling, eyes pleading, looking so much like that child that Gideon's chest ached. Then Gideon looked at Adeline. Steel gray eyes met dark green. And in the space between them, in the cold light of the 60th floor boardroom, Gideon saw three things. Pain, because she knew she was forcing him to choose, and she knew the cost of that choice. Truth, because she hadn't lied or exaggerated or added anything. She had simply placed the evidence on the table and let the light hit it. And choice, because her eyes didn't command or coerce. They asked a single unspoken question. "Who are you?" Gideon turned back to Troy. He looked at his brother, and when he spoke his voice was slow, each word separated like footsteps on thin ice, heavy as stone, every syllable landing in the room like a hammer on a coffin. "I gave you everything." Troy opened his mouth, but Gideon wasn't finished, and his voice didn't rise. It dropped, lower, deeper, more dangerous. "I gave you a name. I gave you a position. I gave you power you never earned. I shielded you from the consequences of every mistake you made for 30 years, because you're my blood. Because our father made me promise to keep you safe. Because I believed that no matter how arrogant, how stupid, how reckless you were still a Caruso, and Carusos don't betray Carusos." Gideon paused, drew a breath, and when he continued, his voice fractured at the edge, just a hairline crack. So small only those who knew how to listen would hear it, but that crack carried 30 years of brotherhood bleeding out. "You sold your brother to the Morenos. You sold my roots, my schedules, my weaknesses, to enemies our father bled to keep on the other side of the river. You didn't just steal money. You stole this family's honor. You stole the trust I placed in you. And you used the Caruso name to smear everything it stood for," Troy stammered, his voice no longer that of a Mafia prince but of a child caught red-handed, shaking, tears spilling. "Gideon, please. You have to let me explain. You're my brother. You can't." Gideon lifted his right hand. Just lifted it. Didn't swing. Didn't point. Simply raised his palm toward Troy, in the universal signal of silence that everyone in the Caruso Empire knew meant the conversation was over, and Troy's words died mid-sentence, as if that hand had closed around his throat. Gideon's steel-gray eyes were red. Not red from tears. Gideon Caruso didn't cry in front of anyone, but red from blood surging, from a body enduring something heavier than any bullet he'd ever dodged, heavier than any war he'd ever fought, the cost of doing the right thing when the right thing meant destroying what he loved most. "Our father would look at you," Gideon said, his voice now so low it was almost a whisper. Yet that whisper echoed louder than any of Troy's screams, "and not recognize you." Silence. Troy shook. His entire body shook. Tears streamed down the face of the 30-year-old man who hadn't cried since the night their father was shot. And those tears bought him nothing in this room. "You're not a Caruso anymore," Gideon said, and the sentence was a death verdict in the underworld. Not death by bullet, but death by erasure, by being cut off from family, from protection, from identity, from everything Troy had ever been. Gideon turned his back on his brother. He pivoted a full 180 degrees, slow and final, and faced the glass overlooking Manhattan. He didn't look back, and his hands, hanging at his sides, clenched so hard his knuckles blanched like bone beneath skin, the tendons standing out like steel cables under impossible load, and that was the only thing that betrayed Gideon Caruso in that moment. Not his voice, not his eyes, but the fists of a man who had just cut away part of himself, and was using every ounce of will not to scream in pain. Adeline let the silence behind Gideon stretch for another 3 seconds, just long enough for everyone in the room to feel the weight of what had just happened. Then she turned toward the end of the table, where Mira Dawson sat with the manila folder clutched to her chest like a shield. Tears still wet on her cheeks, but the confusion gone from her brown eyes, replaced by understanding, the understanding that the volunteer girl from Rosa's, the woman who had held her hand in the hospital at 3 o'clock in the morning and promised she would keep her word, was the same woman now standing at the head of the obsidian table, who had just toppled an empire. "Mira," Adeline said, and her voice softened, no longer the voice of a board chair or the heiress, but the voice of the friend who had sat beside her son's hospital bed while he breathed through an oxygen mask. "Do you want to say anything?" Mira looked down at the manila folder in her hands, looked up at Adeline, then looked around the 60th floor boardroom with its obsidian table, glass walls, and black leather chairs, a world so alien it felt like standing on the moon. But then she remembered Jalen lying in a hospital bed with an oxygen mask and a tiny chest rising and falling. She remembered the 3-generation apartment on Willis Avenue. She remembered Pastor Brooks preaching in the rain because the church had been sealed shut, and she stood. Her legs shook, but she stood. Her voice shook, but she spoke. "You don't remember me, do you, Mr. Caruso?" Mira looked at Troy, the hollow man standing in the center of the room like a ghost of himself, and her voice was small but carried in the absolute silence. 2 years ago, a charity fundraiser for Bronx children at the community hall on Grand Concourse. I served the VIP table. I handed you champagne for you and your girlfriend. You said my hands were damp. You told the manager I was unprofessional and shouldn't be allowed to serve the VIP table. She paused, drew a breath. That fundraiser raised $400,000 for Bronx children. Do you know how much of that actually reached the children? Not a single cent. I know because our community center was listed as a recipient and we never received anything. Troy didn't answer. He no longer could. Mira turned to the entire board, meeting each face in turn. And when she continued, her voice no longer trembled. It was steady. It rang. It carried the power of someone who had nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing left to fear. We're not urban blight. We're not slums to be erased. We're not eggs for you to crack into an omelet. We're teachers. We're nurses. We're waitresses. She glanced at Adeline when she said waitresses, and something passed between them. Recognition, solidarity, respect. We're families. We're a community that's existed on that land for 70 years, 3 generations, and we're the reason this city has people to build for, people to serve, people to do the jobs you dismiss as insignificant, but without which you don't exist. Mira walked to the obsidian table and set the manila folder down on the glossy black surface, the battered folder sitting amid glass, steel, and wealth like a wildflower breaking through concrete, and opened it. Inside were 12 pages of handwritten notes in blue ballpoint pen on lined notebook paper, written at a kitchen table at midnight after Jalen had fallen asleep. Each word slanted but clear, each number calculated on a pocket calculator and checked 3 times. "This is our counterproposal," Mira said. "Partnership, not destruction. Renovating historic buildings instead of tearing them down. Building a new tower, yes, but building it alongside a nonprofit school for neighborhood children. Funding a new community center to replace the one that was just destroyed. There's still profit. We're not asking you to do charity, but the profit comes with the community, not on the community's back." Adeline looked at Mira, and the smile that touched her lips this time wasn't the lethal one, but a proud one, a real one. The first smile anyone in the room had seen reach her eyes. This was the point. This was what her father had wanted her to understand. Adeline sat in the chair at the head of the table for the first time that morning, and her voice returned to its sharp, precise tone, stripped of emotion and reduced to procedure. "I call the vote. First motion. Reject the Titan project as originally proposed. All in favor? Freya, in favor. Board Member 1, in favor. Board Member 2, in favor. Board Member 3, in favor. Board Member 4, in favor. Unanimous. Second motion. Adopt the Helena's Garden Community proposal as the new framework for the project, and appoint Mirabelle Dawson as Director of Community Oversight, with compensation equivalent to an executive director." Mira raised her hand to cover her mouth, a sob escaping between her fingers as tears fell. But these weren't tears of fear or despair. They were the tears of someone who had fought with everything she had and was finally being heard. In favor, in favor, in favor, in favor, in favor, unanimous. Third motion. Remove Troy Caruso from all positions within the project. Freeze all related assets, and transfer the full case file to the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. In favor, in favor, in favor, in favor, in favor, unanimous. Concluded, Adeline said. The oak doors opened and 2 men in simple black suits entered. Sinclair, private security, professional faces, not aggressive but leaving no room for negotiation. They stood on either side of Troy without touching him, simply standing, and their presence was enough. "Mr. Caruso," one of them said politely. "This way, sir." Troy stood there, the hollow shell of what 30 minutes earlier had been a Mafia prince, and he looked toward Gideon. His brother still stood with his back turned, facing the glass, looking out over Manhattan. And Troy waited. He waited for Gideon to turn around. He waited for those steel-gray eyes to look at him one last time. He waited for any sign that 30 years of brotherhood still left a fragment behind. Gideon didn't turn. Troy had to bend down and pick up the chair he'd knocked over to retrieve his briefcase from beneath it. And that act, the act of picking up his own things without anyone doing it for him, was the final and perfect humiliation, because it meant he was no longer someone others served. The aura of power, the name, the suit, the Patek Philippe watch, all of it was still on his body but hollow, like a crown on the head of a deposed king. Security guided Troy toward the door, gentle but final. And as he crossed the oak threshold, he looked back one last time, his desperate gaze searching for his brother's back, and found only that back, straight, unmoving, unturned. The door closed. Troy Caruso vanished. And the sound of the door closing in the 60th floor boardroom didn't sound like a door at all. It sounded like a coffin lid. The boardroom on the 60th floor slowly emptied. Freya escorted Mira out, pressed the gold pen Adeline had prepared into her hand, and told her that her first vote, as Director of Community Oversight, would be selecting a new architect for Helena's garden, that there was a great deal of work ahead, and it would begin tomorrow. Mira held the gold pen as if it were a key to a door she'd never dared to dream could open, and when she crossed the oak threshold she looked back at Adeline once, just once, and in that look was a gratitude no words could ever fully hold. The 4 board members left one by one. Conrad nodded to Gideon and stepped out, closing the door gently. Rowan was last. He looked at Gideon, still standing with his back to the glass, at Adeline still seated in the chair at the head of the table, and by the instinct of a man who'd followed Gideon for 20 years he understood this was not a moment he should witness, so he stepped out and closed the door. The boardroom was empty. Only 2 people remained. Manhattan lay beyond the windows like a vast map lit by gray sunlight filtering through cloud cover, and Gideon Caruso stood there, spine straight, arms hanging at his sides, his hands no longer clenched, but the red crescents of his nails still pressed into his palms, staring out at the city he'd spent half his life building, a city that now looked different, not because it had changed, but because he had. The silence stretched on for a long time, not heavy but exhausted, the weariness of 2 people who'd fought too many battles and were finally laying down their weapons. Gideon spoke first without turning around, his voice low and rougher than usual, as if the storm that had passed had scraped his throat raw along with everything else. He said she'd known from the start, before she poured the first drink. Adeline said she knew Troy was stealing, but she didn't know he'd be that cruel. Gideon said she could have told him, and added that he would have handled it. Adeline replied that he would have protected his brother, that it was instinct, that she needed him to see the truth with his own eyes, and hear it with his own ears, and choose for himself, because if she'd forced the choice he would have chosen blood every time, and Troy would have kept destroying things until there was nothing left. Gideon was quiet for a long time, then spoke so softly it was almost a whisper, bringing up the night at Aurelia, when Troy grabbed her wrist and called her nothing. He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried something Adeline had never heard from Gideon Caruso before. Shame. He said he saw it all and did nothing, sat there with a glass of whiskey, and let his brother humiliate her, harass her, call her nobody, because of rules, because of discipline, because of that damn principle about never undermining family in front of outsiders. He finally turned. Those steel-gray eyes that had watched people beg on their knees, eyes that never blinked, were red now, not with tears because Gideon Caruso didn't cry in front of anyone, but with blood rushing through them, with a man enduring something heavier than any bullet he'd ever dodged, heavier than any war he'd ever fought. The price of doing what was right when doing what was right meant destroying the thing he loved most. He said it was the biggest mistake of his life, not because she was Adeline Sinclair, not because she was the heiress, but because even if she were just Lena, only Lena, $15 an hour, white apron and slip-resistant shoes, she never deserved to be treated that way, and he'd let it happen. He took a single step closer and stopped, as if asking permission through distance alone, and said that if she allowed it, he'd spend the rest of his life making it right. Adeline rose from the chair at the head of the table. She looked at him, and in that moment, every layer of armor fell away at once, not slowly but together, like snow melting off a roof when the sun finally touches it. And the woman standing before Gideon was not the heiress with code names and plans, not Lena with an apron and a service smile, not the board chair with a blade-sharp voice and ironclad evidence. She was just Adeline, 27 years old, fatherless, 2 years lonely, strong to the point of breaking. She stepped close, stood before him, and placed her palm against his chest, over his heart, exactly where she could feel the beat through his black suit. A beat faster than she'd imagined, faster than anyone would ever expect of Gideon Caruso, because beneath granite and steel and discipline he was human, and humans' hearts race when they stand close to someone they're afraid to lose. She said she didn't want him to make it up to her, her voice for the first time carrying no role at all, soft and real, trembling slightly at the end, the most beautiful sound Gideon had ever heard, and said she wanted him here. Gideon looked down at her hand on his chest, small and slender, and on her left wrist was the crescent-shaped scar he'd noticed at the Carlisle, and he placed his hand over hers, warm and heavy, his fingers closing around hers, the scar resting between their hands like a reminder that they both carried wounds, and they were both still standing. He said that even when she was Lena, $15 an hour, white apron, slip-resistant shoes, standing at table 7 pouring him a drink, he knew she wasn't ordinary, that he didn't know who she was, but he knew what she was. She asked what, and he answered that she was dangerous, the kind of dangerous that kept him awake, the first person in 20 years to look him in the eye without bowing her head. Adeline felt her eyes burn, and she didn't fight it. For the first time in 2 years, she allowed herself not to be strong. Gideon bent down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, but she didn't. His forehead touched hers, skin to skin, warm, and the two most powerful people in New York stood in the empty boardroom on the 60th floor, without armor, without masks, without code names, without distance. Just two people who'd lost too much, carried too much, been lonely too long, and finally found each other. Beyond the glass, Manhattan stretched out below them, a city of darkness and light, of predators and prey, of skyscrapers and forgotten neighborhoods, and somewhere beneath them in the South Bronx, Helena's garden still stood waiting to be rebuilt. And Mira Dawson was riding the bus home with a gold pen in her hand and the promise that her son would breathe. They say power corrupts, but sometimes power reveals. Troy Caruso used power to crush others and call them nothing. Adeline Sinclair used 6 months as nothing to expose the truth and protect those the world deems invisible. Troy lost everything in one morning. Adeline, Mira, and the Helena's Garden community gained a future. And Gideon Caruso, the most dangerous man in 5 boroughs, learned the most expensive lesson of his life, that real strength isn't in how loudly you can shout, but in who you choose to listen to, in which side you choose when choosing what's right means losing the thing you love most. This story isn't just about a waitress and a mafia boss. It's about a simple truth all of us need to remember, that titles don't define human worth, that the smallest person in the room is sometimes the strongest, that silence doesn't always mean surrender, but can mean a storm is gathering, and that kindness, sincerity, and the courage to stand up for others are always stronger than money and power. If this story touched your heart, please tap like right now. Share this video with someone you love, someone who needs to be reminded they are not nothing, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more inspiring stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever been underestimated, dismissed, called nobody, when you knew the value you carried inside? Have you ever had to choose between what was easy and what was right? Share your story in the comments below. We truly want to hear what's in your heart, because every story deserves to be heard, like Mira's, like Adeline's, like every one of ours. We wish you all good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace, warmth, and love. Thank you for listening. Goodbye, and see you in the next video, where nothing becomes everything.